Well, good evening, everyone. Man, oh man, them mosquitoes are bad tonight. Well, they are this way every summer. We get these mosquitoes, and there's not much you can do about it. You get bit, but I've got this bottle of this bee itch stop right here in my pocket. It's this little bottle. This stuff works like magic. Takes the itch away from all these pesky biters. It also works on bee stings and wasp stings and even spider bites. And just about anything that irritates and makes your skin itch. Right? And you can get a bottle on a website. It's BEEITCHY.com. That's beeitchy.com. And send it right to your door. Well, folks, tonight we're in the final episode of Thomas Robinette, the Bigfoot Hunter. I know you're all sorry to see it end, but the author, who's also one of our listeners, Joe, tells me he's working on more stories for us, so if you might be hearing more of him. In fact, we have a special short story written by Joe that we'll be telling you here tonight. And that's where we're headed now, so get you something in your mug and find you a place to get comfy, and let's get into chapter 18, the final chapter. Thomas Robinette, the Bigfoot Hunter. Thomas was dreaming of Jake when he realized that the face licks weren't part of the dream. He woke up to find his dog standing by his cot with his front paws on Thomas's pillow. Seeing Jake filled Thomas with joy. It was like he was reunited with Sarah and the boys again. He rolled over and he scratched old Jake's head. And while he was doing this, he felt where Jake was receiving several stitches behind his right ear. Now, these stitches were holding the wound together as they should, and the dog was healing well. Jake wouldn't need them for more than a couple more days at the most. Well, Thomas swung his legs over to the side of the cot and put on his boots. He decided not to undress when he went to rest because he knew if something happened, he'd need to mobilize quickly. Well, looking around, he noticed that everyone else was already outside of the tent. Pulling up his boots, he went outside to join them. He counted 35 cow elk and 3 bull elk. Jake ran up to greet Crystal as she and Emery were drinking coffee and conversing privately. And after she rubbed his ear, Jake returned to Thomas's side. "Now that's a good shepherd," a voice said behind him. "Would you want to sell him?" "Thanks, but no thanks," Thomas said as he turned around. Standing behind him was Jimmy Stone. "Well, it's good to see you, Jimmy," Thomas exclaimed as he offered his hand to shake. "I thought you'd be down for a while." "Not this man," smiled Jimmy. "I got too much to do and too many more things to lay around and let ugly nurses give me sponge baths." Thomas laughed. "Well, it's good that you're up and at it, but are you okay, really?" Thomas asked. "Absolutely," Jimmy said. "I think I was mostly scared a bit that I had lost your dog to those hunters. I don't know how I would have explained that to you. Your dog really kept his head about him and saved our bacon up there." "Well, what did happen?" "Well, we were tracking those dogmen," Jimmy said. "We came to a place where we stopped to get a drink of water out of the canteen some ways up the mountain. I was sitting on a tree trunk and I was looking at some wolf tracks when I went to offer Jake some water. He snarled at something behind me. At first I thought he was snarling at me, but he leapt over my shoulder at something and was growling. He got hit pretty hard by something. I found out almost immediately that what he was attacking was one of them wolf hunters. It was about to snatch me away when dog intervened. Next thing I remember is being hit really hard from the back, being carried under something's arms. We were traveling a while because I was blacking out and waking up off and on when I heard a whistle. I thought someone was calling their dog until all hell broke loose. I was dropped to the ground and kicked aside like a sack of apples. After a short but loud struggle was going on over me, another big pair of hands picked up both Jake and I off the ground and carried us up to the cave where we met up with you. One of the grandmothers brought out some moss and chewed it while I put it on Jake's head. After that, I passed out. When I woke up, a younger grandmother was feeding me something like a juice or something. When I swallowed about 3 times, my mouth went numb and I just passed out. It tasted like how magnolia seeds smell. And you know the rest. Wow, Thomas said, that's one terrifying and amazing encounter. If you ever need to talk about it, feel free to contact me. I'd love to listen to your encounter again just to see if you remember any more details. Maybe so sometime, but for now I'm just trying to forget the whole thing, Jimmy says. A little while later, as Thomas sat around the fire with Jimmy drinking coffee and scratching the dog's ear, they heard the sound of a herd of ungulates moving through the underbrush. Why, the second herd of elk was just beginning to meander into the clearing and join the first group. After counting the second group, Crystal informed Emery that they now had 70 total elk collected there. The herders were accompanied by an off-road 4x4 utility-type military vehicle that carries both extra armed personnel and ranch hands who set out building a temporary corral around the clearing, enclosing the elk before they realized that they were trapped. On the side nearest to the campsite, there was a double gate erected along with a livestock chute that could be used to separate out the individuals from the herd. Now, Thomas watched the workers efficiently complete their tasks and built 2 watchtowers for the guards to be able to observe the surroundings. He knew that things were about to change for the Sasquatch people. They were about to be introduced to things that were as foreign to them as alien technology would be to modern man. However, knowing that the Leviathan International Corporation would be there to buffer their first contact made his mind rest easier. He hoped that with people like Crystal and Jimmy Stone along, they would make sure that the culture clash wouldn't be disrespectful as it had been when the Europeans and the indigenous people from this continent first met. The future was bright, and the days would come as they always did. Now that things were wrapping up here, he looked forward to returning to Mississippi and Sarah. When the sunset lowered down behind the western horizon, he heard now that familiar lonesome whistle come from the ridge, far away to the northwest. The old man of the forest had seen their promised herd of elk. Thomas would see his friend again soon. And after the last answering whistle was heard, coming from across the valley, in response to Danae's summons, Thomas let out a long howl to let his friend know that he'd heard his call and he was expecting a visit. Well, there it is. It's been a good few weeks listening to this tale, and we're kind of all sorry to see it go to an end, but we do have another short story tonight by Joe, like I told you, and I'm going to tell it to you. It's called SMOKY MOUNTAIN BOOGERS. I think you're going to enjoy it. But first, I need to put on a little more of this bee-itch oil on my arm where I just got another bite. Another one of them mosquitoes got me. Man, they're really biting tonight. Well, I'll pass this bottle on around and let y'all try it. It smells really nice, and it's made with all natural ingredients. No chemicals. None whatsoever. It's safe to use on humans of all ages. Boy, oh boy, this stuff really works. Okay, let's get on with it. SMOKY Mountain Boogers. Well, this is another Thomas Robinette Bigfoot Hunter story by Joe Flippo. Now, the call came in just like any of over 1,000+ calls had before. The voice on the other end of the line was a man in his early 30s. Years of experience told him that the man was apprehensive about making this call. The calls all start out about the same. Hello, Mr. Robinette. You don't know me. I heard about you on a podcast on YouTube. You know, the Hidden Corners. I hate to bother you this evening, but my name is James Barron. I was wondering if I could talk to you about a Sasquatch. I promise, I'm sane and sincere. Well, hello, Mr. Barron. Nobody here thinks you're crazy. What's going on with you today? Be honest with you, Mr. Robinette, I'm told by everybody that it's a black bear, but I don't think it is. I think it's a Sasquatch. Okay, Mr. Barron, I answered. Why don't you start from the beginning? Yes, sir, he said, with a hint of relief in his voice. First off, Mr. Barron is my dad, so please call me James or Jimmy. My sister and brother-in-law, Andrea and Lowell Brewer, and I have about 2,800 acres just outside of Flintstone, Georgia, where we run a couple hundred head of cattle. This year we have lost 6 calves and a full-grown steer to what I believe to be a Sasquatch. My brother-in-law, a Lowell brewer, is convinced that it's a black bear. Well, it could be, I stated. Why don't you think it's a bear? By the way, call me Thomas or Tommy. Well, frankly, I don't think that a bear can twist a full-grown black Angus steer's head around 360 degrees. All we have are black bears over here, and they run off when people approach. They act mostly like feral dogs. Well, I have to admit that I can only agree with that statement, Jimmy. Black bears slash with their claws. They don't grab and twist unless they use their mouth, and that doesn't go all the way around. Can you help me, Thomas? I'm at my wit's end over here. Jimmy's voice accented his exasperation. Well, I can't promise you anything, but I'd be happy to check it out for you. And today's my wife Sarah's birthday, so I can't leave on this weekend, especially since I just flew back home yesterday. But I will contact you on Sunday, and we'll make plans to drive over. Let me get something to write with, get your contact information, your address. After writing down the pertinent information, we said our goodbyes and I hung up the phone. Chapter 1. It was early Monday morning when I left out for Flintstone, Georgia. Yesterday I'd contacted Jimmy Barron and received information that he had made arrangements for me to stay at a hotel in East Ridge, Tennessee. And that was about 30 minutes away from me. I arrived at the hotel. It was a Super 8 on Ringgold Road. I checked in, received a key and a smile from the clerk. Then I went on to my room. After freshening up a little bit and resting from my drive, I called Jimmy and told him where I was, and I asked him to meet me for lunch at the La Potra restaurant. There I formally met him, and we ordered our food over nachos and salsa. Would you like to fill me in on all the details you left out Friday? I asked Jimmy. He was a tall, lanky, dark-haired guy with Coke bottle glasses and a crooked smile as the food was set down by the waitress. Well, really not much to tell, Jimmy answered. Basically, we found the dead steer after losing several calves. The steer wasn't torn up, but he had his head twisted 360 degrees, like something had twisted his head to choke him to death. Now, no meat was taken, but the animal had some kind of really oily piss all over it. There had to be at least 2 gallons of it. Didn't make sense to us. Lowell, that's my brother-in-law, found what he thought was a large bear track. They were funny, though. There wasn't any indication that the rear paw had stepped into the front print. No claw marks around the ball of the front track or anything. The only real damage was done to the steer's hind end. It was ripped out and had blood all around the area as if it had bled to death. That's quite possible, I informed Jimmy. Then I added, the old ones didn't call them boogers for nothing. Well, I ate in silence as Jimmy continued to fill me in on the topography of the property. Basically, it was a fenced-in mountain with several foothills where the cattle grazed most of the year. And in late summer, they roamed up to the top of the mountain where they grazed on grasses, indigenous fruits, occasional blackberries. If you'd like, Jimmy stated after our food was finished, we can head on over to the property now. Well, the ride over to the farm was pleasant for a hot July day. The air conditioner in the truck Jimmy drove was determined to keep the moist heat out of the cab. I watched out of the window into the forest that we passed, looking for the real telltale signs of any booger activity. If the signs were any indication just driving down the road, there was a healthy breeding population of old men of the woods present in this part of Georgia. I noticed everything from boundary markers to tree twists and broken limbs that were dead giveaway to the trails that they used for anyone with the right knowledge and an open mind to see. Well, before too long, we entered a long private driveway. It led to a large 2-story farmhouse in an open yard that had a menagerie of chickens and guineas and ducks wandering free range around the yard, looking for an unlucky insect to devour. I noted with interest that the driveway led past the house and continued up into the mountains. It looked well kept, despite the torrential rains that can travel through this part of the state. Sitting out on the front porch were the owners of the house. Lowell Brewer was an average Irishman with a shock of brown hair and beady eyes. Sat in a porch glider with his wife, Andrea. She was a beautiful Cherokee woman, long black hair, big brown eyes. olive-colored complexion. Running around the yard were 3 boys, all under the age of 8, but older than 3 or 4. Well, that's Lowell and Andrea, Jimmy said, and they live here on the farm with their 3 hellions, but I also own half of the farm, see? My sister owns the other half since our parents died and left us these acres and house. Getting out of the truck, I was glad that I didn't bring Jake with me, although I knew he would have enjoyed the trip. And after getting home from my last excursion, I noticed how that dog had been moping around. I thought he might have been getting sick, but he perked up when we got out of the truck at home, and I honestly couldn't bring myself to tear him away from the boys so soon after their sweet reunion. Looking at their boys, I smiled to think about my sweet wife Sarah wrangling Jake and our 2 hellions, as Jimmy described these boys, back home not 5 hours away. As we walked up to the driveway to the house, I noticed that there were dogs barking in the backyard. Now this is another reason why I was glad to have let Jake have this trip at home. Jake was well trained, but definitely the alpha where dogs were concerned. I noticed that the dogs in the kennels were walkers. The largest one looked to be about 70 pounds. There wasn't but one dog that was almost half the size of mine, and he was a bloodhound laying at his master's feet. It wasn't until 2 mountain curs ran out from under the porch and started barking at us that the bloodhound grumbled at them and stood up to give out a loud and deep bellow, so very famous with the breed. Now, old Red won't bother you none, Jimmy said. He was Daddy's old coonhound. Now, those 2 mountain curs are Buddy and Leroy. You say their names and they expect you to rub their ears every chance they can mooch it off of you. Now, we use them to help herd our cows. It's the walkers in the back that you need to watch. Individually, they're all okay, but as a pack, they can get that mob mentality and they can attack pretty quick. Lowell uses them to hunt bears and hogs. Brumley, their alpha pack dog, snapped at my sister once, and she made Lowell keep 'em kenneled from that point on. God help any of those animals if they decide to snap at one of those kids. The other dogs are Rail, the Segundo, Hatcher, Flippo, Crazy, and Fred. They're all top-notch hunters, but put them together and they're just unbeatable. Chapter 2. Andrea left the porch and ran to hug Jimmy when we were halfway to the house. Then, as if given the starting shot of a horse race, the 3 boys raced and knee-tackled their Uncle James. Lowell was the last person to arrive to welcome us to the farm. You must be this Sasquatch expert Andrea and Jimmy seem to be talking about all weekend, Lowell said, without offering his hand in welcome. Well, hello, my name's Thomas Robinette, I said, but I've never claimed to be a Sasquatch expert, or a researcher either, for that matter. Then what exactly are you? Lowell asked skeptically. Well, Mr. Brewer, I'm a hunter who saw a Bigfoot down in Texas about 18 years ago, and I use my skills in the woods to help others find a peaceful solution to strange or terrifying encounters on their home place. Well, to be upfront and honest with you, Lowell started. Mr. Robinette is my dad or grandpa. Just call me Thomas, I said. Jimmy noticed that I didn't give his brother-in-law the option to call me Tommy. A brow arch from Jimmy behind Lowell's back caught my attention. Well, to be honest with you, Thomas, Lowell began again, I think this whole idea is a bunch of horse shit. I don't think any alien or imaginary Bigfoot or fairy or Indian little people stole my calves or killed my steer. I don't believe in old green eyes either. Those are Andrea's livestock, not yours, Jimmy was quick to correct Lowell. Or if you want to get technical, they're ours, said Jimmy. That's why it wasn't your decision to ask Thomas to come out here in the first place. So you can just get off your high horse and go back onto the porch if you can't be neighborly. And without another word, Lowell Brewer went and sat down on the glider that he had just vacated earlier. Well, I apologize for Lowell, Thomas, Andrea said sincerely. You are welcome here, and you are permitted to be anywhere inside our main fence that you wish to go. I even put it in writing in case you decide you need to be here at some oddball hour of the night or morning and we can't be reached. And with that, she produced a notarized statement just to that effect. It was signed by both Jimmy and Andrea, had the same day's date written on it. "Thank you, Mrs. Andrea," Thomas said. "Jimmy promised to show me around the mountain today." So, Jimmy and I then went around the side of the house to one of 4 Razor side-by-sides that was bought to transport people and supplies across the farm. As we began our trek across the property to see what we could find, Jimmy took the time to point out any storm damage or man-made anomalies. It was plain to see that their father had been a good steward of the property. "And how long have you owned this place?" Thomas asked Jimmy. "Well, we've been here all our lives," answered Jimmy. Then he added, "My grandpa bought this property from his great uncle back in 1935. And my dad was reared on this land, as were Andrea and I." "Have you ever had anything weird happen in the past?" Thomas asked. "Well, that's the funny part, Thomas," Jimmy said. "There ain't been any reason to suspect that we have had boogers here until just the last calving season. We had 80 pregnant cows, and when it was all said and done, we had 74 calves and 6 bawling mamas who had to be milked. Their calves were dropped because we found the placentas and the afterbirth fluid on the ground, but the babies had just vanished. At first, I thought maybe someone had been stealing the calves before they could have their ears tagged, but then that steer come up dead, and Andrea and I began considering a possibility after we heard about you on that Hidden Corners podcast. We were impressed with your knowledgeable surmisings and contacted that Clay Steele feller to get your contact information." Well, it was well after sunset before Thomas and Jimmy finished looking around the lower pasture. And right at sundown, they stopped for a 30-minute break, just to stop and listen and hear the animals moving about, and some waking up for the night shift and some getting ready to head back into the woods for a good night's sleep. And not hearing or seeing anything, the two returned to the farmhouse to catch Andrea up on their discovery. She'd be interested to know that there had been multiple clear signs that a family of Sasquatch had moved into the area recently. There was even enough convincing evidence that there may have been also a nursery on the property down by that large creek that provided the water for the cattle. After filling Andrea in over a hot supper that included everyone but Lowell sitting at the table, Thomas asked Jimmy to carry him back to his hotel for the night. "Today was a long day for me. What with the traveling here and all, I plan on getting a good night's sleep and returning tomorrow evening for an all-nighter on the mountain. If that's okay with you, Jimmy." "Well, you're the expert," Jimmy surmised. "What you think is the best way to go about this is how we'll do this. Let's get you back to your room, and I'll come by after work tomorrow evening and pick you up. Supper's on us tomorrow again." When they arrived at the hotel, Thomas said his goodnights to Jimmy, exited the truck, and went up to his room to get some much-needed shut-eye. The sun was almost to the top of the western peaks when the sentinel heard the voice of the side-by-side in the distance. From his perch, 2,500 feet above and half of a mile away, he watched the 2 bald, 2-legged ones looking around the lower pasture areas. It did not escape his attention that they were looking at every boundary marker, trailhead, and source indicator that was in their area. Not only did they understand what they were looking at, the duo was finding the resources as well. As he watched in silence, his first thought was to run and tell the alpha, his father. His second thought was that if he did that, then he would have to admit that those calves he took weren't deer that he skinned out before bringing them home. This would mean a manger thrashing for sure, but his duty still pressed him to say something. As he looked over his shoulder, he saw how peacefully his mother and siblings and grandparents and his young uncle were sleeping. Now, those uptight wolves had really stirred things up a couple of moons ago when they tried to steal his baby brother. Father, although asleep for now, was still injured from his vicious fight. His uncle's wife had been killed and partially eaten in the heist by the dogmen. It was an afterthought of the enemy's leader to catch up his little sister and try to escape. Only her shrill screams and the excellent hearing by his father and uncle had saved her from becoming another meal for them. By the time his uncle, his father's younger twin brother, arrived to help, the alpha had dispatched all 3 of the kidnappers and was fighting their mates in a losing battle. His uncle arrived to see his alpha standing over the child, snarling, clawing, and punching, and just fighting off them 3 wolves. He hadn't arrived with much time to help because he entered the clearing and the 3 females had just tackled him to the ground. He used his massive body to cover the child, and he was clearly tiring out when his younger brother charged in, ripping out arms and pulling off jaws until his tirade left the 3 enemies mangled and dead. The fight already concluded by the time he and the others arrived on the scene. Grandfather and uncle, after seeing that the child was safe with mother, carried the alpha back to their cave. And that began his responsibilities as another hunter for the family. At first, he liked the idea that he had adult responsibilities, but when he realized that there was more to hunting deer than just waiting for uncle to scream to jump out of a tree, his excitement turned to frustration. Frustration led to well-intended mistakes. Now those mistakes led to him watching those cattle giving birth and him swiping the calves. And it wasn't until the 2-legged with the storm stick made thunder and lightning at him that he realized the severity of his mistake. It was his uncle who killed the grown steer after he lured it up to the top of the mountain with the heifer mating call. That action was what led to the 2-legged ones looking for their resources. The sentinel was shaken out of his thoughts by the strong hand of his uncle on his shoulder. Without saying a word, the sentinel pointed a crooked finger toward the 2 investigators down in the lower pasture. A low growl escaped from the uncle's lips as he motioned for his nephew to go rest a little while he watched the action below. Some deep instinctual urge told him that there was nothing amiss with the way those 2 were looking at the trail markers that he'd made down near that lower pond. As he watched the nonverbal body movements of the 2 men, he could almost understand what they were talking about. He was about to get up, make his way down closer to see if he could get a better vantage point, when the 2-leggeds got back on their bloodless beast and rode it away as it screamed in agony. It was almost dark. It was almost hunting time. Uncle was plenty hungry after his long nap. The disruption of the walking wolves had caused a lot of disturbance in the ecosystem. All the normal food animals moved on to other safe food sources. Tonight, uncle and nephew would find a large heifer and kill her, rip her into manageable pieces and bring them home so everyone could get their fill for the first time until these seasonal plants begin to produce. Cow meat tastes a lot like other deer meat, but it had a deeper blood richness that Uncle had come to appreciate. Although Alpha had forbidden anyone from taking cattle from that lower pasture, Uncle wasn't opposed to snatching one from across the mountains from their home. Alpha knew he was guilty of those kills, but since it wasn't happening under his nose, he just looked the other way. And now that Alpha was hurt and recovering, food was a necessity. Getting it was a free-for-all event. Well, Chapter 3. It seems like I had just laid down to rest my eyes when my cell phone ringer alerted me to a call. I looked at the alarm clock on the bedside desk to see that it was 4:06 a.m. Well, I had only been asleep for 4 hours and some minutes when the call came in. Groggedly, I answered Jimmy's call. "Hello," I groaned. "Thomas, I hate to call so early, but something's happened." Jimmy's voice was bordering on panic. "I'm on my way to get you. I'll explain when I get there on the way back to the farm." And without waiting for me to answer, Jimmy hung up the phone. Now, 10 minutes later, I was ready and waiting in the parking lot for Jimmy to arrive. I only had to wait around 5 minutes before I saw him turn into the parking lot and pull up just long enough for me to jump into the truck and close the door. "Well, God, what's so urgent?" I asked Jimmy. "We had 3 more cows killed about 30 minutes before I called you out on the upper pasture. We could hear it even inside the house." Jimmy's voice held a lot of anxiety. We commuted the rest of the way to the farm in silence. When we arrived at the farm, every light in the house was on. The floodlights on the corners of the barn were casting their lights all about the yard, and the lighting around the dog kennels was blaring all their brightness all the way across the yard to the back porch. Jimmy drove right up to the kennels where Lowell was there preparing to release his Walker hounds. Each one had been adorned with a Kevlar hunting vest used to track bears and hogs. And sensing the coming hunt, the dogs were amping themselves up, and you could almost smell the adrenaline in the air. "What are you doing?" I yelled at Lowell as I jumped out of the truck. "I'm killing me a bear," Lowell answered without looking up from his preparations. "You can't turn those dogs loose," I yelled at him. "You'll lose every one of those dogs if a booger gets a hand on them." "To hell with all this booger nonsense. I'm hunting a bear," Lowell yelled back before releasing the dogs. Andrea opened the back door holding her youngest son, Roy, in her arms. "I just hung up with Fish and Wildlife. She said they have an officer on the way." "Keep everybody inside," Lowell barked back at her. "I ain't waiting on no damn warden to get here. I'm heading out." "Jimmy, you better stay here and wait on the ranger," I said. "You know the land better, and I can go with Lowell and help him. Follow us up the mountain when the warden arrives." "Yes, sir, Thomas," Jimmy answered. Then he turned back to Andrea, and I motioned for her to go back inside so he could close the door and wait for the game warden on the porch. Andrea returned after a couple of seconds and handed Jimmy a Mossberg 12-gauge shotgun. She quickly closed the door behind her as she shut her brother outside. "For the last time," I pleaded with Lowell, "lock those dogs back up while you still can." "It ain't happening, Robinette," Lowell screamed in frustration. "Either get on the side-by-side or stay here with the women and wait for the game warden. Either way, I'm going up that mountain behind my dogs." I jumped onto the passenger seat of the Razor and barely got my belt buckled before he had taken off. Once he started, the dogs ran out ahead of us straight up to the spot where the cows were slaughtered. Arriving on the scene of the massacre after a harrowing 8-minute drive, we found where there was evidence that 3 cows had been slaughtered. There were only heads, large pools of blood, and pieces of cow parts laying around. All the heads had been twisted off of the cattle. The hocks were discarded and twisted off as well. It was plain to see that no bear had killed these cattle. Lowell said nothing, but the look on his face was evident enough that even he believed that this wasn't the work of a bear. There came a loud roar from the underbrush about that time. The dogs went into a frenzy. The dogs circled themselves and barked until Lowell gave them the order to chase whatever was roaring. Once the dogs lit out, there was a loud crashing through the undergrowth as something big pushed saplings out of the way in its escape. The pathway was wide enough that Lowell could drive the side-by-side up it in pursuit of the animals. Fortunately for us, the animal intersected the logging road that led up the mountain. We began traversing it up to the top. Sporadically, we would hear what sounded like the dogs baying something, only to hear the chase continue after just a minute. "It sounds like they're heading for the old chert pit," Lowell realized. "We can go on up the main access road and get there ahead of them, maybe." Well, without waiting for me to answer him, Lowell whipped that Razor around and headed back down to the intersection with that main access road. Now, it took us about another 30 minutes of riding hell-bent for leather to get to that chert pit. But when we arrived there, the dogs had already corralled the old man of the woods in the pit. Chapter 4. Uncle was frustrated. The cow hunt hadn't gone according to his plans. First off, the third nephew gave away their position by giggling out loud. It was his first hunt. Second, father wasn't strong enough to hold the first cow while he broke her neck, so he had to rip out her guts, which gave her time to alert the others. Now, if they hadn't needed more than one cow, that wouldn't have mattered. But the second cow was already bawling, and that brought over the bull. Uncle did kill the bull, but it took quite some effort. And while he killed the bull, father dragged the first cow across the clearing into the wood line, where he tore the carcass into manageable pieces for the nephews to carry back to the cave. Second and third nephews took the pieces and left with grandfather to deliver the pieces home and return for the rest. Uncle had almost finished tearing up the bull and had already sent first nephew off with a piece of it when he heard the dogs barking in the kennel below. He looked off the side of the mountain to see the small two-legged one opening up their kennels. He knew that if he took his kill and went back to the cave, the dogs would follow the blood trail straight to their home. The young and the weaker family members and the alpha would be in a lot of danger. He knew he had to stay behind and make sure those dogs didn't attack his family like those walking wolves had done a few moons ago. Uncle patiently waited for the dogs to come closer to him. The dogs were turned loose as their alpha jumped onto his bloodless animal and followed them up the trail. He knew from past experience that if one of the small ones were hurt or taken, there would be many hands full of their family coming to get him. He didn't like the thought of that aggravation, so he hid in the woodline near where he killed the bull and waited for the dogs. This pack of dogs wasn't as much of a concern to him as the little two-legged ones were. Dogs didn't carry thundersticks or cause pain from a distance. Aggravation, disappointment, and the failure to get away was heavy on Uncle's mind as he waited for his enemies to come to him. Never before had he put his family in danger. This time was different, and he was prepared to pay the consequences of his actions. After all, he was the younger brother of Alpha. His father was Alpha before his older brother. He had learned the same lessons as his brother, and hadn't he saved his brother's life only 3 moons ago? It was time for him to accept this challenge with the same confidence as he had faced other challenges. If things got bad, well, he'd just kill these dogs, their alpha, and carry them home as well. Times are hard right now. Meat was meat. Survival was his life, and he planned on living for a lot of other summers after this one. He prepared for battle as he heard his enemies approach. Now, it wasn't a problem for Uncle to get the dogs to chase him. It also was relatively easy to stay just ahead of him, enough to lead him to where he was going to kill him. He knew about the old chert pit at the top of the mountains. It was a place where he met his extended family and friends from time to time to plan a hunt. He also knew that there was only one way in and one way out for the dogs. He had learned a long time ago to climb up the back wall and roll over the crest to disappear back through the underbrush. The old little two-legged ones with the white hair had made this place over time. When he left and never returned, Uncle assumed that he became too weak to work like his father, who had white hair, past his prime. The younger two-legged ones never left potatoes or any other tubers along the trail for the family to find during the hard times of the years. Those days were easy days that he remembered from his past. And now he has a different problem besides finding food. The pack of tracking dogs were getting closer. He knew he had to quit thinking about the past or they'd be on him before he could realize it. At that moment is when the first dog ran into the clearing where he had been disemboweling and tearing apart the cattle. The first dog was a large bloodhound that was flapping his ears to stir up the scent. Behind him were 2 mountain curs. Those smaller dogs seemed to be just along for the run. And coming along at a slower pace were 6 more tracking dogs. They were the real threat. Uncle had seen them chasing black bears off and on, as well as hogs. He knew the real fight would be with those in the back, wearing the orange vests. Uncle was getting ready to roar when the small two-leggeds could be heard riding their beast up the trail. For the life of him, he couldn't figure out how such a grumbling, miserable animal could exist without killing itself. In all his observations, he could never figure out what that thing's legs looked like. As best he could figure, it crawled like a strange snake on unusual tails that left their unique marks slithered onto the ground. At night, its eyes shone like the big circle in the sky, but even brighter. He watched as the 2 men observed the areas where he killed the cows. He waited until they were about to walk over to his side of the tree line before he roared his challenge to the dogs. The reverberation of his voice was so loud and strong that the first 3 dogs made a beeline for the farmhouse. However, the pack of hunters began bawling back their answer to his challenge. With eager excitement, they circled their tails and waited for their master to send them on a pursuit. The signal wasn't long in the waiting either, for he knew that chase was on, and he ran off leading them away from his ancestral home. Chapter 5. The walkers already had that booger up against the back wall by the time Thomas and Lowell reached a vantage point above the chert pit to look down into it. Amidst all the snarling and growling, there was a lot of posturing by both sides of the fray. The booger was down on all fours and would rush a dog when it got too close to him in hopes that he could grab one and dispatch it. "Well, that ain't no damn bear," exclaimed Lowell. "Now, that's what I've been trying to tell you this whole time," answered Thomas just as emphatically. "Call off the dogs." Lowell took out his signal whistle and called for the dogs to return to him. But in the excitement of the fray, none of the dogs heeded their training, whether because of the adrenaline or lack of hearing. Lowell kept repeating his whistled commands until the booger grabbed the first walker. His massive hand clamped down on the dog named Crazy. With his other hand, the booger grabbed the back end under the doomed dog's tail, twisting the dog in the opposite direction, and just broke that dog wide open. Immediately after the booger did that to Crazy, he pulled the backbone apart and threw that dead dog down. "What the hell?" screamed Lowell as that booger began grabbing the other dogs one at a time and repeating the same action. Lowell grabbed his Marlin 4440 and jumped down off the side-by-side. Before he could aim at the booger, Thomas grabbed the barrel and tried to pull the gun out of his hands. What ensued was a fight for the rifle. Finally, Lowell slung Thomas off of himself and stood up. From the ground, Thomas pulled out his .45 ACP Smith & Wesson M&P shield, and he pointed it at Lowell. "I'll kill you before I die on this mountain for your own stupidity," Thomas yelled at Lowell. "We don't know how many more are headed this way or already behind us, and I ain't letting you shoot that booger." There was a tense moment where it seemed that Lowell was going to shoot it out with Thomas. But luckily for the both of them, Jimmy and the game warden showed up, and the game warden, Bobby Lee Price, jumped out with his pistol drawn and yelled for both men to drop their guns. "Well, that hairy bastard's killing my dogs," repeated Lowell as the booger finished off the last dog. "If you shoot that animal, I will arrest you," Warden Price stated. As he said that, the booger ran up the side of the pit, grabbed the edge, rolled himself over the lip, and vanished into the underbrush on the far side. "We need to have a talk, gentlemen," Warden Price said. "But first, we need to go back down to that house and call my supervisor, because we have a real shit show here this morning. Mr. Brewer, I'll ride down with you to your house. The last damn thing we need right now is a shooting to handle on top of everything else." We didn't stop to pick up the dog carcasses on the way back down the mountain. Warden Price said it was a scene for investigating later when his supervisor arrived. Well, it took 30 minutes to navigate down the access roads back to the farmhouse. While we were heading down, I called into Leviathan Corporation and reported what was happening to Emery Letson, the founder of Leviathan Corporation. He was a cryptid troubleshooting organization that handles situations just like this one for government cleanups, and that I'd been recruited to assist not too long ago. He wasted no time in agreeing to send in a group to clean up the problem Sasquatch. Well, by 7 o'clock, the sun had breached the eastern horizon above the mountain. The Fish and Wildlife Supervisor, Dusty English, showed up with a couple other senior wardens. The group of men, after filling or refilling thermoses of coffee, followed us back up to the chert pit in their four-wheel drive vehicles. To everyone's surprise, except mine, all the carcasses were gone. The only clue of the massacre was bloody pools sporadically scattered out along the floor of the pit where the bugger had thrown down the dispatched dogs. "I guess the old man went and got help to carry off the dogs," Warden English stated into his handheld recorder. He and the other wardens were combing the area and making their own individual recordings of their observations. Well, about an hour later, I saw several black vehicles pulling up the driveway to the farmhouse. "Jimmy," I said, "we need to go down to the farmhouse. I think there are some people that we need to see." Without another word, Jimmy drove me back down to the farmhouse, where Andrea was pouring a platter of coffee cups, all full of steaming chicory coffee, for anybody that just arrived. "Hello, Thomas," boomed the loud voice of Marshall Black, the security coordinator of the Leviathan team. "How's things here?" he asked as the two men shook hands. Things are hopping here, I answered. Bring everyone over here so I just have to say this one time. After shaking hands with Owen, Flippo, Easton Gray, and the rest of the detail, we all thanked Andrea for a cup of coffee and stood in the front yard catching the crew up on the events that led to their orders to come here to the farm. Let's go meet these wardens and pull rank, said Marshall after I concluded my report. We're authorized by the DOI, that's Department of the Interior, to take it from here. The Leviathan Corporation crew followed Jimmy and me up to the massacre scene. Now, is this where the dogs were killed? Owen Flippo asked. Yeah, it is, answered Jimmy. There was 8 of the best bear dogs in this country slaughtered here, just like they was puppies. Dogs don't have a chance against the Sasquatch, Mr. Barron, Easton Gray commented. Then he added, who was this dumbass that turned the dogs loose? I would have figured Thomas would have stopped that before these dogs left the yard. Well, that would be my brother-in-law over there with the wardens, answered Jimmy. And you got the gist of it both times. Lowell's a dumbass most of the time, and Thomas did tell him to lock those dogs back up. He refused to, and Thomas almost shot him when he pulled out his rifle to shoot at that booger while it was killing the dogs. Well, that was probably the biggest service Thomas has done you here, answered Marshall. If he had shot that booger, your family would have no end to the misery these animals can cause out of revenge. Your livestock would be killed and carried off. Your kids could be. Your sister could be, too. Now, you may already have problems, but this is salvageable as long as you follow up with Thomas as is necessary. Now, at that time, the game wardens were led over to our group by one of the detail members that I hadn't met yet. He introduced the wardens by name to Marshall Black and only introduced Marshall's as the boss. Marshall showed the game wardens his DOI, Department of Interior credentials, and gave his supervisor Emery Letson's number to contact for verification. After a stream of yes sir and I understand statements, the game wardens walked to their vehicle and left promptly, taking Bobby Lee Price with them. Why don't you two follow them down, Thomas? Marshall Black instructed Jimmy and me. We'll stop in and have a conversation after we've finished up here. Jimmy and I did as Marshall Black requested and went back down the mountain to the farmhouse. We sat on the back porch and listened as there was sporadic gunfire during the day. At the end of the afternoon, just before dark, the Leviathan Corporation team came down the mountain with their larger flatbed trucks, canvas wrapped and battened down. Marshall Black's vehicle, driven by Easton Gray, stopped at the house while Owen Flippo's vehicle led the group of remaining vehicles off of the property. Well, Thomas, Marshall said, our job is done here. It was a real shit show for a bit up there. However, we've eliminated all the hostiles. The threat is dealt with. So these people should be able to get back to their normal lives. After stating that, he produced several copies of non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, for each of the adults to sign. He instructed Thomas to have a good conversation with them before they signed the agreements, so that each person knew individually what to expect should the agreement be breached. He also informed them that they found evidence that the killers of the family's cattle were probably dogmen that were in turn killed by Sasquatch. After that, he left without a parting goodbye. Thomas spent the rest of the evening listening with Jimmy and his family. After dark, he and Jimmy went to take one more look over the property. They retraced the tire tracks of the Leviathan Corporation's ATVs. They found the skirmish sites. There were 3 in all. That's what they were doing when they came upon a well-used path that led to a cave on the western side of the top of the mountain. Should we go in there and look around? Questioned Jimmy. And before Thomas could answer, a loud and deep guttural growl came from inside the cave opening. I don't think so, answered Thomas. I suggest we get the hell out of here without going too fast or being too curious about what made that sound. As the 2 men quietly walked away, 2 pairs of glowing red eyes looked out of the opening in that cave to see that the 2 men were leaving in peace. The Alpha had lost a brother today, but the clan had also lost the threat of the remaining dogmen that were encroaching upon their land as well. Alpha knew he wasn't in any shape to fight these 2 men. So as he watched them leave in peace, he was more than happy to live and let them live. Well, there you go. It's another good story by Joe Flippo, Thomas Robinette. I'm hoping in the future that I got more of these to tell you about. We'll just have to wait and see. Well, it was a good evening, except for them skeeters. Doggone it. But we know how to handle that now. So anybody got a story to tell, now'd be the time. I'm done for the evening, and I'm out of here. So I'll see y'all next time, which might even be tomorrow night. You never know. Well, till then, be good to everybody. Be good to yourself. This is Clay Steele. Good night.